The clock on the hospital wall ticked past 7 p.m. as Maya Johnson gathered her things to leave. Her shoulders ached from standing over an operating table for hours, but the tired smile on her face told the story of a day well spent. As a pediatric surgeon, Maya had gotten used to the long hours and the emotional roller coaster that came with the job. Today had been especially tough. An emergency surgery on a 6-year-old boy, followed by a complicated procedure on a teenage girl. Both patients were now stable, and Maya could finally head home. "Heading out, Dr. Johnson?" asked Nurse Rita, looking up from her station. "Finally," Maya replied, rubbing her neck. "2 successful surgeries. I'd call that a good day." "Those kids are lucky to have you," Rita said warmly. "Give my best to Darius." Maya nodded, her mind already drifting to the quiet evening ahead with her husband. Maybe they'd open that bottle of wine they'd been saving, or just curl up on the couch and watch a movie. After 12 hours on her feet, even just sitting down sounded like heaven. Outside, the evening air felt heavy with coming rain. Maya pulled her jacket tighter and hurried to her car in the staff parking lot. The first drops began to fall as she slid into her Mercedes, a gift she and Darius had bought themselves last year after her promotion to head of pediatric surgery. She still sometimes felt a little strange driving such a nice car, but Darius had insisted they celebrate her hard work. "You've earned this," he'd said when they picked it up from the dealership. "Don't let anyone tell you different." The rain picked up as Maya drove through the city streets, turning the world outside her windshield into a blur of neon signs and traffic lights reflected in puddles. She turned on some soft jazz, letting the music wash away the tension of the day. Her mind wandered to what might be waiting in the fridge at home. Darius had mentioned making his famous pasta, but with his FBI caseload, plans often changed. The suburban streets were quieter, lined with trees and modest homes. Maya felt herself relaxing as she got closer to her own neighborhood. That's when she noticed the police cruiser that had pulled up behind her. She checked her speed, exactly at the limit. Her brake lights were working. She'd just had the car serviced last week. When the cruiser's lights began flashing, Maya felt a knot form in her stomach. She'd done nothing wrong, but years of living as a black woman in America had taught her to be cautious around police. She immediately slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, positioning her car carefully. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming on the roof. Maya took a deep breath and went through the mental checklist Darius had taught her. Turn off the engine, turn on the interior light, keep hands visible on the steering wheel, registration and insurance in the glove compartment. She watched in her side mirror as the officer sat in his car for nearly 2 minutes before finally stepping out. Something about the delay made her uneasy. The officer approached slowly, one hand resting on his holster. In the glow of her car's interior light, Maya could see his nameplate, Officer Reynolds. His face was set in a hard expression that made the knot in her stomach tighten further. "License and registration," he barked, not bothering with any greeting. His flashlight beam hit her face directly, making her squint. "Of course, officer," Maya replied, her voice calm and professional. "My registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for it now, if that's okay." Reynolds didn't respond, just kept the light trained on her face. Maya moved slowly, retrieving her documents and handing them over with a steady hand. Years of performing delicate surgeries had given her the ability to stay outwardly calm, even when her heart was racing. "This your car?" Reynolds asked, looking at her license and then back at her with obvious suspicion. "Yes, sir, my husband and I bought it last year." "Pretty fancy car for this neighborhood," he said, his tone making it clear what he really meant. Maya felt a flash of anger that pushed it down. "I'm just on my way home from work. I'm a surgeon at Children's Hospital downtown." Reynolds' expression changed then, something like disbelief mixed with annoyance crossing his face. He hadn't expected that answer. What Maya couldn't know was that Officer Blake Reynolds had a history of targeting black drivers in nice cars, a history of complaints that had been filed and then buried. And as the rain continued to fall around them, Maya had no way of knowing that this routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine. The rain drummed harder on the roof of Maya's car as Officer Reynolds studied her license with a frown. She could feel water dripping from the edge of the roof onto her window, creating small rivers that distorted the view of the street beyond. Her fingers remained steady on the steering wheel, but her mind was racing. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," Reynolds suddenly ordered, his voice cutting through the sound of rainfall. Maya blinked in surprise. "May I ask why, officer?" "I don't believe I've violated any traffic laws." Reynolds' face hardened. His hand moved to rest more firmly on his holster. "I said step out of the vehicle. Now." Years of dealing with high-pressure situations in the operating room had taught Maya to stay calm when everything inside her wanted to panic. She nodded slowly. "Of course, officer." As she unbuckled her seatbelt, Maya discreetly pressed the emergency contact button on her phone, a feature she and Darius had set up years ago, but she'd never had to use until now. The phone would send her exact location to Darius with an alert. Just in case, she thought. The rain immediately soaked through her thin jacket as she stepped out. Her comfortable surgery shoes splashed in a puddle, the cold water seeping through to her feet. Officer Reynolds stood too close, invading her personal space in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. "So, you're saying you're some kind of doctor?" His tone made it clear he didn't believe her. "And you drive a car worth more than most people around here make in a year?" Maya took a careful breath. "Yes, I'm a pediatric surgeon at Children's Hospital. I just finished a 12-hour shift. I can show you my hospital ID if you'd like." Reynolds ignored her offer. "Hands on the car, please." "Officer, I don't understand." "Hands on the car." His voice rose sharply, causing Maya to flinch. She complied, placing her palms flat on the wet hood of her Mercedes. The rain was coming down in sheets now, plastering her hair to her face. "I'm going to search your vehicle," Reynolds announced, already moving toward the driver's side door. "Do you have probable cause, officer?" The question slipped out before Maya could stop herself. Her husband's voice was in her head. Darius had always told her to be respectful but aware of her rights. Reynolds turned back to her, his expression thunderous. "You think because you drive a fancy car and use big words, you know the law better than me." "No, sir, I just—" "You just what?" He stepped closer again. "You know what I see." "I see someone who doesn't respect authority. I see someone who thinks they're above the rules that everyone else has to follow." Maya stood perfectly still, rain running down her face. "I respect your authority, officer. I'm simply trying to understand why I was pulled over." Reynolds circled her like a predator. "Your taillight was flickering." Maya knew that wasn't true. She just had the car serviced last week, and everything was in perfect working order. But she bit her tongue. "I need to check if there's anything in your vehicle that shouldn't be there," Reynolds continued, pulling open her car door without waiting for a response. Maya watched in disbelief as he began roughly going through her things, tossing aside her medical journals, rifling through the center console, pulling out her gym bag from the back seat, and dumping its contents onto the wet passenger seat. "Officer, please," Maya started. "Quiet," Reynolds snapped. He held up her hospital badge, studying the photo and her name. Something in his demeanor shifted slightly, but the aggression remained. This could be fake. Anyone can get these made. The absurdity of the accusation left Maya momentarily speechless. She was aware of a car passing by slowly, the driver watching the scene with concern but not stopping. The feeling of being alone and exposed intensified. Reynolds emerged from the car holding her phone. "This was recording. Were you recording me?" His voice had a dangerous edge to it now. "No, sir. It must have activated accidentally." Maya felt her heart hammering against her ribs. The emergency alert to Darius had gone through. She was certain of that much, but how long would it take him to arrive? And what would happen in the meantime? Reynolds took a step closer, his face inches from hers. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." "Am I under arrest?" Maya asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "What's the charge?" "Interfering with a police investigation," Reynolds said, reaching for his handcuffs. "And I don't like your attitude." Maya could feel the situation spiraling out of control. In the distance, she heard the faint wail of another police siren. Whether it was help or more trouble, she couldn't tell. All she knew was that she needed to stay alive until Darius could find her. As Reynolds roughly grabbed her arm, she looked directly into his eyes and said with quiet dignity, "My husband will be looking for me." Reynolds sneered. "Lady, I don't care if your husband is the president," Right now, you're dealing with me. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Maya's wrist as Officer Reynolds roughly grabbed her arm. The rain had soaked through her scrubs underneath her jacket, and she shivered from both the cold and from fear. Her medical bag lay open on the wet ground, important papers getting ruined in the downpour. Please, Maya said, trying one more time to reason with him. My ID badge is real. You can call the hospital and verify. Dr. Maya Johnson, head of pediatric surgery. Reynolds tightened his grip. I'm tired of your mouth. You people always have some excuse or some story. Maya froze at his words. You people. The mask had slipped, revealing what this was really about. Her expensive car. Her professional job. Her skin color. It was a story as old as America itself, but knowing that didn't make it any less terrifying to be living it. Officer, I have rights, Maya said quietly, but firmly. Rights? Reynolds let out a harsh laugh. Right now, you have the right to shut up and do exactly what I tell you. As he reached for her other arm to complete the handcuffing, Maya noticed her phone on the hood of the car where Reynolds had tossed it. The screen was lit up despite the rain hitting it. The emergency call to Darius was still connected. The knowledge gave her a small measure of comfort. She wasn't completely alone. I'm going to need you to empty your pockets, Reynolds demanded, his voice taking on a new edge. My pockets are empty except for my hospital ID, Maya replied. And I'd like to call my lawyer. Reynolds' face darkened. Oh, now you want a lawyer? What are you hiding? Nothing. I just know my rights. Maya's voice remained steady, though her heart was racing. The lessons Darius had taught her over the years about dealing with law enforcement were the only thing keeping her composed. Reynolds stepped closer, his face inches from hers. His breath smelled of coffee and cigarettes. Turn around and put your hands on the car. Now. Maya complied, feeling more vulnerable than ever with her back to him. The cold metal of the car hood pressed against her palms. She could hear Reynolds calling in on his radio, requesting backup for a non-compliant subject. The deliberate mischaracterization of her behavior made her stomach twist. Badge number, she whispered to herself, focusing on the numbers on Reynolds' uniform. 7438. It was important to remember details. That's what Darius always said. Through the rain, headlights appeared down the road, slowing as they approached the scene. Maya felt a surge of hope. Was it Darius, or just the backup Reynolds had called? The car pulled to a stop about 30 feet away, its lights illuminating the rain in bright white beams. Reynolds seemed distracted by the arrival, momentarily loosening his grip on her arm. Maya took the opportunity to glance at her watch. 20 minutes had passed since she'd been pulled over. If Darius had received her alert, he would be on his way by now. Stay right where you are, Reynolds ordered her as he took a step toward the newly arrived vehicle, his hand moving to rest on his weapon. Maya remained still, watching through the curtain of rain as a figure emerged from the car. Even from a distance, she could tell it wasn't Darius. The newcomer wore a police uniform. Reynolds' backup had arrived. What do we have here, Blake? The new officer called out, approaching them. Just a woman who thinks the rules don't apply to her, Reynolds replied. Pulled her over for a broken taillight, and she's been giving me attitude the whole time. The second officer, his nameplate read Wilson, looked Maya up and down, then at her car. His expression was unreadable. Found anything? Wilson asked, his voice neutral. Not yet. Was about to do a full search when you pulled up. Maya caught Officer Wilson glancing at her medical bag on the ground, the hospital logo clearly visible on its side. Something in his expression shifted slightly. Ma'am, is there a problem here? Wilson asked her directly, which seemed to surprise Reynolds. Before Maya could answer, the sound of another vehicle approaching caught everyone's attention. This car was moving fast, its headlights cutting through the rain with urgency. It came to an abrupt stop behind Wilson's cruiser. Reynolds immediately stepped in front of Maya, as if to block her from view. Stay back, he shouted at the newcomer. Maya felt her heart leap as a familiar figure emerged from the car, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with purpose. Even through the rain, she would recognize her husband anywhere. Darius had arrived, his FBI badge already in his hand, catching the light as he approached. Reynolds' posture changed instantly as Darius drew closer and the federal badge became visible. The officer's hand, which had been resting on his weapon, slowly moved away. "Federal agent," Darius called out, his voice calm but carrying authority that cut through the sound of rainfall. "I need to understand what's happening here." Maya saw Officer Wilson straighten up, clearly recognizing that the situation had just dramatically changed. Reynolds, however, stood his ground, though she could feel the tension in his body as he kept his position between her and her approaching husband. "This doesn't concern the feds," Reynolds said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Just a routine traffic stop." Darius stopped a few feet away, his eyes meeting Maya's for just a moment, a silent communication passing between them. "Are you okay?" his eyes asked. She gave a tiny nod, though her handcuffed wrist told a different story. "I believe it does concern me," Darius replied evenly, turning his attention back to Reynolds. "That's my wife." The rain seemed to pause for a moment as the words hung in the air. "That's my wife." Darius's voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable edge of controlled anger. His FBI credentials caught the light from the police cruiser's headlights as he held them up. Officer Reynolds blinked rapidly, looking from Darius to Maya and back again. His confidence visibly faltered, but he quickly tried to regain his composure. "That doesn't change the fact that she was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop," Reynolds insisted, though his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. Darius took another step forward, rain dripping from his coat. His eyes never left Reynolds' face. "I'd like to see the dashcam footage of this uncooperative behavior," he said, "and I notice my wife is in handcuffs. What exactly is she being charged with?" Officer Wilson, who had been watching the interaction with growing concern, cleared his throat. "Maybe we should all calm down a bit," he suggested, clearly sensing the tension in the air. "I am perfectly calm," Darius replied, his voice level. "I'm simply asking what probable cause existed for stopping my wife, searching her vehicle without consent, and placing her in handcuffs." Reynolds' jaw clenched. Broken taillight. "Really?" Darius raised an eyebrow. He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen a few times before turning it toward Reynolds. "Because I just received a very interesting alert from our home security system. Our driveway camera recorded Maya leaving for work this morning. All lights on the car are functioning perfectly." Maya watched as Reynolds' face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, and finally something that looked like fear. She'd never seen Darius this way before. The same man who made silly faces at breakfast and sang off-key in the shower was now radiating a quiet power that seemed to fill the entire street. "I think," Darius continued, taking another step forward and lowering his voice, "that we have a situation here. Officer Wilson, would you please remove my wife's handcuffs?" Wilson looked at Reynolds, who remained frozen in place, then back at Darius's FBI badge. Making his decision, he moved toward Maya. "Ma'am, I'm going to take these off now," he said quietly, producing a key. "Thank you," Maya whispered as the metal restraints fell away. She rubbed her wrists, red marks already forming where the cuffs had been too tight. Darius's eyes softened momentarily when they met hers, silently asking if she was okay. She gave him a small nod. 12 years of marriage had given them the ability to communicate volumes without speaking. "I think we're done here," Reynolds suddenly announced, his earlier bravado replaced by a thinly disguised attempt to retreat from the situation. "You're free to go, ma'am." "No," Darius said, the single word stopping Reynolds in his tracks. "We're not done. Not by a long shot." He pulled out his phone again. "I'm calling Sergeant Phillips at your precinct. I believe he'll want to know about this incident." Reynolds' face paled at the name. "Look, there's no need to involve the sergeant. It was just a misunderstanding." Darius ignored him, speaking into his phone. "Tom, it's Darius Johnson. I need your help with something." He glanced at Reynolds. "One of your officers just detained my wife without cause." He paused, listening. "Yes, that's right. Corner of Maple and Oak. Officer Reynolds, badge number 7438. Maya watched as Reynolds seemed to shrink before her eyes, the realization dawning that this wouldn't be swept under the rug like perhaps other incidents had been. Officer Wilson had the good sense to look uncomfortable. As Darius continued his conversation, a black SUV with government plates pulled up beside them. 2 more agents stepped out, their expressions serious as they surveyed the scene. "My colleagues," Darius explained to the officers as he ended his call. standard protocol when a federal agent reports a potential civil rights violation. The rain had eased to a light drizzle, and for the first time since being pulled over, Maya felt like she could breathe again. She moved to stand beside her husband, drawing strength from his presence. "Ma'am," one of the newly arrived agents addressed her respectfully, "we'll need to take your statement. Would you prefer to do that here or somewhere more comfortable?" "I'd like to get out of the rain," Maya replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The agent nodded. "Of course. We can use our vehicle." Reynolds started to back toward his cruiser. "If that's all, I should get back to my patrol." "You're not going anywhere," came a new voice. A police car without lights or sirens had arrived, and a man in a captain's uniform stepped out. Maya recognized him from community meetings, Captain Harris, the precinct commander. Darius nodded at the captain. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "When the FBI calls about one of my officers, I make it a priority," Harris replied grimly. His eyes landed on Maya, taking in her wet clothes and the red marks on her wrists. "Dr. Johnson, I want to personally apologize for whatever happened here tonight." Reynolds looked like he wanted to disappear. "Captain, I can explain." "Save it for the formal inquiry," Harris cut him off. "Officer Wilson, please secure Officer Reynolds's weapon and badge." The street had become a flurry of activity. More vehicles arrived, an internal affairs car, another FBI vehicle. Maya stood in the middle of it all, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what had happened and what could have happened if Darius hadn't arrived when he did. Darius seemed to sense her distress. He gently placed his coat around her shoulders and led her toward the FBI SUV, away from the chaos. "It's over now," he said softly just for her ears. "You're safe." As they walked away from Reynolds, Maya heard Captain Harris say, "This is the third complaint this month, Reynolds. But this time, you picked the wrong person to harass." Maya leaned into her husband's strength, her body finally beginning to shake with the delayed shock of the encounter. "I never thought it would happen to me," she whispered. Darius's arm tightened around her. It shouldn't happen to anyone. The inside of the FBI SUV was warm, a stark contrast to the cold rain outside. Maya sat wrapped in Darius's coat, a paper cup of hot coffee between her hands. She hadn't wanted it, but the female agent, Agent Chen, had insisted, saying something about shock and keeping warm. "Can you walk us through exactly what happened?" Agent Chen asked gently, her notepad ready. Maya took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. The events of the last hour seemed both crystal clear and strangely distant, like watching a movie of someone else's life. She began with the moment Reynolds had pulled her over, recounting each detail as precisely as her surgeon's memory allowed. Outside the SUV's tinted windows, she could see Reynolds sitting in the back of Captain Harris's car, his face a mask of barely contained anger. Officer Wilson was speaking with Darius and another agent, gesturing toward the police cruiser's dashboard camera. "He kept asking how I could afford the car," Maya continued, her voice steady despite the lingering fear. "When I told him I was a surgeon, he didn't believe me. That's when he ordered me out of the car and things escalated." Agent Chen nodded, taking notes. "And did he state a reason for the initial stop?" "He claimed my taillight was out, but that's impossible. We just had the car serviced last week." As Maya continued her statement, she watched through the window as a tow truck arrived. A technician began examining her Mercedes, paying special attention to the taillights. After a few minutes, he gave a thumbs up to Captain Harris. All lights were functioning perfectly. "He lied," Maya said softly, more to herself than to Agent Chen. "He pulled me over for no reason at all." "Unfortunately, Dr. Johnson, this isn't the first time we've heard about Officer Reynolds," Agent Chen replied, her tone professional but sympathetic. "There have been other complaints, but nothing that stuck." "Until now," Maya said. Agent Chen nodded. "Until now." The SUV door opened, and Darius slid into the seat beside Maya. His face was composed, but she could read the anger in the tight line of his jaw, the way his hands couldn't quite stay still. "The dashcam footage confirms everything," he told them. "Reynolds muted his body mic for most of the encounter, but the video is clear enough. And your phone recorded the audio." He reached over and squeezed Maya's hand. "You did everything right." Maya hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words until that moment. The tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over, running down her cheeks in silent streams. Darius pulled her close, not caring about protocol or professionalism or the fact that they were surrounded by colleagues. "I was so scared," she whispered against his shoulder. "All I could think about was those news stories, those videos where things go wrong so quickly." "I know," Darius murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "But you're safe now, and Reynolds won't be able to do this to anyone else." A knock on the window interrupted the moment. Captain Harris stood outside, his expression sullen. Darius rolled down the window. "Dr. Johnson, I want you to know that Officer Reynolds has been placed on immediate administrative leave," Harris said. "His badge and gun have been surrendered, and there will be a full investigation. This kind of behavior has no place in my department." Maya appreciated his words, but they felt hollow against the reality of what she'd just experienced. "How many complaints were there before mine, Captain?" she asked quietly. Harris had the decency to look uncomfortable. There were concerns, but nothing substantial enough to take action on. "Nothing substantial." Darius's voice was dangerously calm. "Or nothing from someone with enough influence to make you listen." The captain didn't have an answer for that. After an awkward moment, he nodded stiffly and walked away. Maya watched him go, a new feeling settling alongside her fear and relief, determination. "This can't just disappear," she said. "Not this time." Darius looked at her with a mixture of pride and concern. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about all the people who don't have an FBI agent for a husband," Maya replied. "All the people Reynolds has harassed who couldn't fight back, who weren't believed, who had to just take it and move on." Agent Chen, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up. "The Bureau takes civil rights violations very seriously, Dr. Johnson. With your statement and the evidence we have, this won't just be an internal police matter." "Good," Maya said firmly, "because this isn't just about me." As if on cue, a news van pulled up at the edge of the police line that had been established around the scene. A reporter and cameraman emerged, already filming the activity. "Word travels fast," Darius observed. Maya watched the reporter trying to get comments from the officers at the perimeter. For a moment, she considered staying hidden in the SUV, protecting her privacy. But then she thought about her patients, the children from all backgrounds who looked up to her, who needed to know that standing up for what's right matters. "I want to make a statement," she said suddenly. Darius looked surprised. "Are you sure? You don't have to do this right now." "Unsure," Maya replied, her voice growing stronger. "People need to hear what happened from me, not from some police press release that downplays everything." Agent Chen nodded. "It's your choice, Dr. Johnson, but whatever you decide, we'll back you up." Maya straightened her shoulders and handed Darius back his coat. Despite her wet clothes and the ordeal she'd been through, she carried herself with the same quiet dignity she brought to her operating room. As she opened the SUV door and stepped out into the now gentle rain, camera lights immediately swung in her direction. "Dr. Johnson," the reporter called out, recognizing her from a recent hospital fundraiser. "Can you tell us what's happening here?" Maya took a deep breath, feeling Darius's solid presence beside her. "Yes," she said clearly. "I can tell you exactly what happened tonight and why it matters." The camera lights felt hot on Maya's face as she stood before the small crowd of reporters that had quickly gathered. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving behind a gleaming wet street that reflected the flashing police lights. Darius stood slightly behind her, a steady presence at her back. "My name is Dr. Maya Johnson," she began, her voice clear despite her exhaustion. 2 hours ago, I was driving home from a 12-hour shift at Children's Hospital where I performed emergency surgery on 2 children. I was pulled over by Officer Reynolds for what he claimed was a broken taillight. The reporters leaned in closer, sensing this wasn't going to be a typical statement. Maya took a deep breath and continued. "What followed was 20 minutes of harassment, intimidation, and violation of my civil rights. I was ordered out of my car in the rain, my vehicle was searched without consent or probable cause, and I was handcuffed without being charged with any crime. The only thing I did wrong was drive a nice car while being black." A murmur ran through the small crowd. One reporter called out, "Are you filing charges against the officer?" "This isn't just about filing charges," Maya replied. This is about a pattern of behavior that has been allowed to continue unchecked. I've learned tonight that Officer Reynolds has had multiple complaints filed against him, all of which mysteriously went nowhere. She paused, looking directly into the main camera. The difference in my case is that I have the evidence and the resources to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. But I keep thinking about all the people who don't have what I have, an FBI husband who came to my rescue, the means to hire attorneys if needed, professional status that makes people listen. Beside her, Darius stepped forward. As an FBI agent who specializes in civil rights cases, I've seen this scenario play out too many times. What makes this case different isn't just that it happened to my wife. It's that we have irrefutable evidence, dashcam footage, audio recordings from my wife's phone, and multiple witnesses. A tall woman in a sharp suit approached the impromptu press conference. Maya recognized her as Diane Powell, the city's district attorney, known for her tough stance on corruption. Someone had called in the big guns. My office will be reviewing all evidence in this case, Powell announced, positioning herself next to Maya. And we'll be conducting a thorough review of all previous complaints against Officer Reynolds, as well as departmental response to those complaints. The reporters erupted with questions, but Powell raised her hand for silence. That's all I can say at this time. But I want to thank Dr. Johnson for her courage in coming forward. Maya felt a strange mixture of emotions, exhaustion from her long day and the traumatic encounter, relief that she was safe, and a growing sense of purpose. As the DA stepped away to speak with Captain Harris, Maya turned back to the microphones. "I'd like to say one more thing," she said. The reporters immediately quieted. "Tomorrow morning, I'm scheduled to perform surgery on a 7-year-old boy. His name is Lewis, and he has a tumor that needs to be removed. His parents are worried, as all parents are when their child faces surgery. They trust me with their son's life, not because of what I look like, but because of my skills as a surgeon." She paused, letting her words sink in. Officer Reynolds didn't see a doctor who saves lives. He saw only the color of my skin and decided that was enough to treat me like a criminal. That kind of thinking doesn't just hurt the people who are directly targeted, it hurts our entire community. As she finished speaking, an older woman pushed through the small crowd of onlookers that had gathered. Her hair was gray, her face lined with years of experience. "Dr. Johnson," she called out, her voice wavering slightly. "I need to speak with you." The woman approached Maya with determination. "My name is Rose Taylor. Officer Reynolds did the same thing to my grandson last month. Nobody would listen to us. Would you be willing to hear our story?" Before Maya could answer, another voice called out from the crowd. "He did it to me too." A young man in his 20s stepped forward. "Last summer. Same thing, said my taillight was out when it wasn't. Searched my car, roughed me up. I filed a complaint but nothing happened." Suddenly, it seemed like a dam had broken. 2 more people came forward with similar stories. Each one described the same pattern. Reynolds pulling them over for minor or non-existent infractions, aggressive behavior, searches without consent, and dismissal of their complaints afterward. Darius exchanged looks with Agent Chen, who was already on her phone, presumably calling for additional agents to take statements. The DA had stopped her conversation with the captain and was watching the scene unfold with intense interest. "We need to document all of this," Darius said quietly to Maya. "This is bigger than we thought." Maya nodded, then turned to address Rose and the others who had come forward. "I hear you," she said simply. "And I promise you, your stories won't be ignored this time." Captain Harris looked increasingly uncomfortable as more people shared their experiences. He approached Maya and Darius, his earlier confidence now replaced with visible concern. "Dr. Johnson, I want to assure you that we take these allegations very seriously," he began. Maya cut him off gently but firmly. "With all due respect, Captain, if that were true, Officer Reynolds would have been stopped long before tonight. The question now is, what are you going to do about it?" The captain had no immediate answer. Behind him, Maya could see Officer Reynolds still sitting in the back of the police car, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of disbelief and anger. For the first time that night, Maya felt something unexpected, not fear, not anger, but a sense of purpose. "This ends now," she said, loud enough for the cameras to catch. "Not just for me, but for everyone." 3 months later, Maya sat in the back row of the courtroom, watching as Officer Reynolds entered with his attorney. He looked smaller somehow, his uniform replaced by a gray suit that seemed a size too big. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, community members, and most notably, the 12 people who had come forward with their own stories of harassment at Reynolds' hands. "You don't have to be here today," Darius whispered, his hand covering hers. "You've already given your testimony." Maya shook her head. "I need to see this through," she replied quietly. "We all do." Across the aisle, Rose Taylor caught her eye and gave a small nod of understanding. In the months since that rainy night, Maya had gotten to know Rose well. The older woman had become something of a grandmother figure to the group that now called themselves Reynolds Witnesses, a name they had chosen to reclaim their power as they fought for justice. The judge entered, and everyone rose. Judge Watkins was known for her no-nonsense approach and fair rulings. She surveyed the courtroom before taking her seat. "We're here today for sentencing in the case of the state versus Blake Reynolds," she announced. "The jury has found the defendant guilty on multiple counts of civil rights violations, falsifying police reports, and abuse of power." Maya felt a wave of emotions, relief, vindication, and a touch of sadness for what should never have been necessary. The past 3 months had been a whirlwind. The dashcam footage from Maya's encounter had gone viral, sparking outrage and closer scrutiny of the police department. Internal investigations had uncovered that Captain Harris and several senior officers had been burying complaints against Reynolds and other officers for years. "Before I pronounce sentence," Judge Watkins continued, "I'll hear final statements from both sides." Reynolds' attorney spoke first, asking for leniency, citing Reynolds' years of service. When it was the prosecutor's turn, she simply played a compilation of the dashcam videos from multiple incidents, letting Reynolds' actions speak for themselves. Then, surprisingly, the judge looked out into the courtroom. "Dr. Johnson, I understand you've requested to address the court." Maya stood, smoothing down her skirt. This hadn't been planned, but yesterday she felt compelled to ask for this moment. She walked to the front of the courtroom, feeling the weight of all eyes upon her. "Your Honor, I'm not here to ask for a harsh punishment," Maya began. "I'm here to talk about healing." She turned slightly, allowing herself to look directly at Reynolds for the first time since that night. "What happened to me and to others in this room wasn't just about one officer making bad choices. It was about a system that allowed those choices to continue unchecked. It was about the belief that some lives matter less than others." The courtroom was completely silent. Even Reynolds was looking at her now. "Since that night, I've performed 11 surgeries on children who needed help. I didn't ask about their backgrounds or judge them by appearances. I just did what I was trained to do, heal." Maya paused, gathering her thoughts. "Our community needs healing too. That's why I've started the Equal Justice Initiative with the help of my husband and many others in this room. We're working with the new police chief to implement better training and accountability measures. We've established a support network for victims of police misconduct who don't have the resources to fight back." She turned back to the judge. "Whatever sentence you give today, I hope it sends a message that this behavior won't be tolerated. But I also hope it's the beginning of something better, not just the end of something painful." As Maya returned to her seat, she noticed something unexpected, a tear rolling down Reynolds' cheek. It wasn't theatrical or manipulative. It looked like the response of someone finally seeing the true impact of his actions. Judge Watkins nodded thoughtfully before pronouncing her sentence: 5 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 3, provided Reynolds completed extensive rehabilitation and bias training programs. Additionally, the judge added, "I'm ordering the city to implement the training program proposed by Dr. Johnson's initiative to be overseen by an independent review board." Outside the courthouse afterward, Maya faced the inevitable press conference. The story had captured national attention, becoming a rallying point for police reform advocates. "How do you feel about the sentence?" a reporter called out. "Justice was served," Maya replied. "But this was never just about punishing one person. It's about changing a system." Beside her, Rose Taylor stepped forward. "Because of Dr. Johnson, people are finally listening to those of us who've been ignored for too long. This isn't the end, it's just the beginning." Later that evening, Maya and Darius sat on their back porch, watching the sunset. It had been a long day, the culmination of months of testimony, advocacy, and hard work. You know what I keep thinking about? Maya said, leaning her head against Darius's shoulder. What's that? That little boy, Louis, whose surgery I performed the morning after everything happened. I saw him for a follow-up today. He's cancer-free. His mom brought me cookies. She smiled at the memory. Darius wrapped his arm around her. You saved his life. And maybe now we're helping save others, just in a different way, Maya replied. When I was standing in the rain that night, I was so scared. I never imagined it would lead to all this. Her phone buzzed with a message. The Equal Justice Initiative had just received a major grant to expand their work to neighboring cities. Another small victory in what they both knew would be a long journey. Ready for whatever comes next? Darius asked. Maya looked out at the sunset, thinking about how a moment of injustice had transformed into a movement for change. More than ready, she replied. We're just getting started.